I'd like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and to pay my respects particularly to their elders past and present, and thank them for having me here today. And I'm very pleased to be here. This is one of a number of comments and discussions I've had in the palliative care area. And at the end of this paper, or maybe in the session later, you might like to ask me how come I'm part of, a very passionate commitment to prevention and health promotion, and yet here I am talking about death. And I actually think they go together really well. In starting today, I sat back and thought about how I would like to die. And I'd like to die with someone who cares for me, whether it's a family member or not, really holding me, both physically and emotionally. I'd definitely like to die pain-free in this day and age. I'd like to die terror-free, so that I'm not absolutely terrified about what's next, if anything. I'd like to be in a familiar place, because I think it's far more likely that I'll feel held in a familiar place. And I'd like to be able to let go, because I think it's not so frightening. I'd like to die leaving as my last bequest to my family and to others I know that it is possible to bear death and to die well. That would be, I think, one of the best bequests that you could leave. But how am I likely to die? I'm likely to die untouchable because of others' fear of dying and my own. I'm likely to die, even though we are second in that line, still I'm likely to die excluded from the community and either in a medical setting or in a nursing home, so in an institutional setting of some kind. It's even possible in Australia, and it happens, and it hits the media sometimes, but it doesn't always hit the media, that I might die in an apartment or a house, not being found for days or weeks because nobody knows or cares about me anymore. So that's still a possibility. And I can't even count in Australia, in this day and age, on being able to die pain-free. But I certainly won't die terror-free because of the sort of comments that the Minister made about still the terror associated with death. So death in Australia has a bad reputation, I would say. And when Prince Gautama, later the Buddha, left his palace for the outside world, he saw a poor man, a sick man, and a dead man. And he knew that any philosophy that could not comprehend these realities would be completely without meaning. Because the fact is that we live with illness, we acquire disabilities, we get older and we die, and that's life. And yet you would think in Australia that this is a truth too stark to be avoided. And accepting these realities is, in my view, Australia's greatest struggle as a society. What difference would it make to us as individuals, families and communities if we did accept that illness is inevitable, that disability is inevitable, that ageing and death are inextinguishable facets of the only existence we can touch? Artists in the Middle Ages were fascinated by the dance of death, a series of scenes where a skeleton in robes pulls a king from his throne, a bishop from his altar, a knight from his horse, a peasant from his plough. The glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. Death lays his icy hand on kings. Sceptre and crown must tumble down. There was a lot of death around, of course, what with wars and plagues and famines and childbirth. People had a close personal relationship with death. Statues on a king's tomb would show him in his robes, laid out in all his glory, the great and powerful figure he had been in life. But if you peered down to look under the table, there would be another statue of a rotting corpse to show what he looked like now. I have been like you, their gravestones read, and you will be like me. But that's not the image we cultivate at modern funerals. French historian Philippe Ariz has written, "In our day we have witnessed a brutal revolution in traditional ideas and feelings. It is really an absolutely unheard of phenomenon. Death so omnipresent in the past that it was familiar would be effaced, would disappear. It would become shameful and forbidden." Yet we see a lot of what one might call death. On any given night, you can see several dozen violent deaths depicted on TV and in the movies. Advertisers pay top money for their commercials to be shown during television portrayals of death, and mass audiences jam cinemas to see gunplay and flying bodies, all of whom, however, are shot absolutely dead, rather than receiving spinal injuries or brain damage or punctured lungs. When gunfighters shoot it out in Main Street, they don't die of septicemia. So nobody in video games is hospitalised. They're just blown away, far, far away. Death is, to be sure, further away than it was in the Middle Ages. We're dying older in the main. Life expectancy in Australia has gone up by 22 years over the last century and is still rising by 4 months a year, which I suppose is a third of the way to living forever. I'm not suggesting that this is not a good thing or that the function of a health system should simply be to say, well, people have got to die sometime, I suppose it might as well be today. Yet 52% of health resources are spent on the last 2 years of life. Anything to keep people alive at whatever cost, financial and emotional, because the alternative is too awful. By contrast, in certain sections of the population, in the Aboriginal community, for example, where the average life expectancy is 15 years less than in the general population, the extension of life is a primary imperative. It's something that we owe. For other Australians, however, Australians are a long-lived people, with life expectancies within a year or two of the best in the world, within a few years of what we can ever expect to get. Childbirth is now less frequently fatal in our part of the world, and we do not see a dead body often. Out of sight, out of mind. Yes, we've been able to repress much of the meaning of death. We think about death as little as possible, which is in a way odd because not dying of war or plague or whatever doesn't in point of fact mean that we're not going to die. When all medical improvements are counted in, any actuary will actually assure you that all causes death rate remains an absolutely unaltered 100%. Each of us faces successive medical challenges as our bodies and minds age, but however often these are successfully mastered, the option of retiring undefeated is not offered to any of us. And nobody in the history of the world has ever lived happily ever after. And still we seem to drop without a second thought into believing that we ought to live forever, that we ought to stay young forever, that we ought to be in perfect health, and that any death, anywhere, at any age, is the sign of a mistake that can be remedied with more money or more research. It's like these oughts have replaced genuine human rights at the dying stage of life with what I call magical thinking rights. It's a version of magical thinking of some societies where every death from any cause is really due to witchcraft, and it's simply a matter of working out how to overcome that. The truth is we live with illness, we acquire disabilities, we get older and we die, not in any linear order either. We can be ill, disabled and die at any age. That's life, and you would think that that's a truth too stark to be avoided, yet I believe that accepting these realities is the greatest struggle as a society. Even the movement towards legal euthanasia, which one might think would be a death acceptance movement, can in another way be seen as an attempt to skip over dying, to cut it short and dismiss it. Is Australia less accepting of death than other Western countries? The UK has had a community-based palliative care system for decades. Well, forever, really, I think. It's for a long, long time. This enables people to live at home in the last stages of dying, right to the death knell. It stems from the age-old practice of laying out bodies in the lounge room for relatives and friends to come and pay their respects. Children can have a look and even touch. The horror of death is replaced by acceptance, and death becomes part of life. I can understand that voluntary euthanasia is still an important option for people to fight for, but how many people are currently passionate about euthanasia because they can't bear the thought of being alone and unsupported in the last stages of dying? And you can really understand that. How many people simply don't want to be a burden because our society sees both life and death as being their own private individual responsibility rather than a collective right of life? And how many people simply loathe and fear death so deeply and find it so frightening that cutting dying short could be seen as an act of desperation? We laugh at the interminable extended deathbed scenes in the novels of Dickens, partly because of their unfashionable moralising, but partly because we no longer feel that the dying have anything of value to say to the living, because we no longer see any connection between this world and death. Perhaps what we do seriously need, like I was very interested in Claire's comments about what you wanted the tagline to be, because I wonder if we do need, and this is serious, a social marketing campaign to popularise death, because not accepting death has very serious spin-off impacts on life. Hating and fearing death seems to be strongly connected with hating and fearing fallibility in human beings and imperfection. Hatred of death is connected to the worship of youth, but not all youth, only those who are perfect. The imaginary media images of models who are impossibly slim and improbably buffeted. The fantasy of living forever is importantly in an indefinitely young and perfect body. It's not a fantasy of living forever old and wrinkled. Imperfection includes old, it includes chronically ill, it includes disabled. And in some ways, healthism is the cure, and I might go into more of that in the session later. I wrote a book called Just Passions and asked the question in that about health promotion, that if you are diagnosed with cancer of the lungs, heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes or impotence, is it your own fault? What is it that you have eaten, smoked, drunk or thought that has brought down your own illness or disability or death? Is it a punishment on your cursed head? And of course, you know, I answer that question by saying that making fear of death as the reason to promote health has a lot of downside. It has the downside that we're talking about today. And as for ageing, just remember how Gulliver in his travels happened across the Struldbrugs who lived forever, unfortunately for them. They were not only, this is from Gulliver's Travels, they were not only opinionated, peevish, covetous, morose, vain, talkative, but incapable of friendship and dead to all natural affection. Envy and impotent desires are their prevailing passions. At 90 they lose their teeth and hair. They have at that age no distinction of taste. This is quite serious actually, but eat and drink whatever they can get without relish or appetite. The diseases they were subject to still continue without increasing or diminishing. They never can amuse themselves with reading because their memory will not serve to carry them from the beginning of a sentence to the end, and by this defect they are deprived of the only entertainment whereof they might otherwise be capable. Gulliver wasn't around when there was TV. But it brings the complexity of the question of what we're doing as a society in the adding of years to life. And is it about the fear of death and the 100% living forever that Gulliver's Travels portrayed? The past is another century, the older people live in it much of the time. Trying to come to grips with the fact that disability, ageing and death are ordinary parts of life is, of course, the major theme I explore in my book, Just Passions. And I acknowledge my own struggle to accept my own disability because of its association with death. I quote, the most from myself, which is sort of odd. I'd never thought of that before. The most frightening part of being around people more disabled than me was that just looking at them flicked a little switch in my mind. They reminded me that further disability and illness, and even death, might be just around the corner. Better not to know, better not to have to think about such awful human inevitabilities. So that I talk in the book about how I think the terrible struggle we have in movements for disability rights and ageing rights are very much to do with people's fear of death and of the reminder we are that death is there, that it puts it in people's faces. Because we don't want to think about disability, illness, ageing and death. We don't come to terms with them and they return in strange forms. And it's even possible that the popularity of zombie horror movies represents the return of the repressed unconscious desire to live forever, even if the form is less than desirable. But disability is the norm. A disease-free status is almost rare enough to be a pathological condition. In people over 75, the figure who are disabled or chronically ill rises to 96%. So for 96% of Australians, death follows disability from ageing, if not other causes. So normal is actually a purely theoretical construct, existing only in the mind. Nobody in the real world is normal. And when we banish bodily imperfection and the ravages of age from our culture, we banish ourselves. And we're left only with supermarket checkout magazine fantasies of infantile narcissism. Our hatred of death ends up shaping our view of what is acceptable in life. And so because disability reminds us of illness, getting old and dying, it too isn't a reality that the modern world is happy with. It's only when we acknowledge the universality of disability, ageing and death, and their non-medical dimensions and realities, will it become inevitable that the rights of people become valued and genuinely protected. Everybody should have their human rights protected. People dying, like people with disabilities, badly need to have rights. The right to dignity, the right to be consulted, the right to be comforted, the right to be held, the right to be pain and terror-free. People who are entering the inevitable ageing and dying life stages must also retain their autonomy. But autonomy doesn't mean an individualistic independence or a pseudo-independence involving doing everything under one's own steam. Looking after oneself is currently a very popular philosophy, even if it does mean people living and dying in lonely isolation, either because they can't get around or because they are left in emotional and social loneliness. And that's often because we can't bear to face and provide adequately for the inevitability of death. Our social and political ethos has become obsessive with only valuing people in terms of their value to the economy. And if you aren't valuable, or if you become less valuable because you're ill, disabled, ageing or dying, then you do receive relatively miserable and declining support that you now have to prove over and over that you do deserve. It's what I call an economic rationalist approach to dying. And I think it needs to be counterposed with another, a very different model, where we do provide each other with mutual support and interdependence. We need a new notion of value in Australia very badly, measured not only by economic contribution that people can make, but by the personal decisions people can make. Not by the quantity of tasks one can perform without assistance, but the quality of life we can live right up to death with help. And it's the type of help which is designed with interdependence and dignity and respect as the core values. A good enough community based on respect for people's rights at all stages of life, including dying, must surely be based on mutual support. And focusing on community acceptance of disability, illness, ageing and dying is a good starting point, because unaccepting communities aren't good enough. The acceptance of the value of palliative care, to me, reflects how society feels about itself. And it should express society's highest aspirations and ideals. And among those ideals must be an acceptance of death as an inextinguishable facet of the only existence we can touch. Buddha left his palace for the outside world. He saw a poor man, a sick man and a dead man, and he knew that any philosophy that could not comprehend these realities would be without meaning. As the great disability intellectual and activist Irving Zola said, people in the Western world have great difficulty accepting such realities. We continually deny that we may get old, sick, disabled and die. We think of all those things as happening to someone else, and in all those denials we deplete ourselves of the very resources to deal with our own inevitable fallibility. And as long as we deny such vulnerability in ourselves, we will never be able to accept the disease and disability in others. And I would add to that the dying in others. Accepting disability, illness, ageing and death as inevitable parts of life means that we will direct our resources to ensuring that the community is welcome to people as they die, so that they can live fully supported lives right up to the end as a part of our society. So let's end with the last word or the nearly last word from that famous advocate for disability, ageing and dying rights, William Shakespeare. And he said, what in ill thoughts again? Men must endure their going hence, even as they're coming hither. How we treat dying and death in Australia is a hallmark of what sort of society we are. And I'd like to end on the question that I started with. How would you like to die? Thank you.